I see the tracks. They lead deeper into the canyon. The strayed horse is close! Keep pushing! I will not back down. I can smell your fear. There's no escaping.
The desert held its breath before the wind ever moved. Buzzards that had circled all morning scattered without cause, wings cutting silent arcs toward the far ridge. Cattle bunched tight against the corral fence, eyes rolling white, though nothing walked the yard. Then the wind came, low, dragging over the mesquite like something exhaling after a long climb. Thomas Bellinger stood at the edge of his land with a shovel in his hands and a dead man at his feet. An Apache warrior, arrow-pierced, left where the cavalry had abandoned him. Thomas didn't know his name. He only knew the ground deserved better than to let him rot in the open. He began to dig. Somewhere behind him in the brush, something exhaled that was not the wind. Thomas Bellinger had buried more things on this land than he cared to count. A wife lost to fever 2 winters back, a father who'd worked himself into the dirt before Thomas was old enough to shave, 2 dogs, and more calves than any rancher should lose in a single drought. He was 34 years old and had learned the hard way that the desert did not negotiate. It simply took. And a man either endured or he didn't. The ranch sat 11 miles from the nearest town, a scattering of clapboard buildings called Serrano's Crossing that existed mostly because a stagecoach line had once thought it worth a stop. Thomas kept to himself there. He traded for supplies, nodded at men he'd known 15 years, and rode home before dark. Solitude suited him. It asked nothing of him that he couldn't give. The land itself told a different story than the one the territorial papers printed. Apache bands moved through the canyons to the west and the army moved after them. And somewhere in between, ordinary men like Thomas tried to keep cattle alive and roofs standing. He'd never had trouble with the Apache himself. A few had passed through his land over the years, taken water from his well, left without incident. He figured a man who didn't go looking for a fight rarely found one waiting. That assumption ended on a Tuesday in late September, when he rode out to check a fence line and found a dead man half swallowed by the brush. The warrior had been dead perhaps a day. An arrow, not a bullet. His own people's from the angle of it, or so Thomas guessed, that though he understood little of such things. Whatever had happened, it had happened badly, and whoever he'd been running from had not bothered to finish the job or bury the evidence. Thomas sat his horse a long moment, hat pushed back, sweat cooling on his neck despite the heat. He could have ridden on. Most men would have. A dead Apache on Bellinger land was, by the ugly math of the territory, nobody's business and nobody's loss. Instead, Thomas dismounted. He didn't know why. Not exactly. Except that his father had once told him a man's decency wasn't measured by how he treated people who could repay him. It was measured by what he did with the dead who couldn't. Thomas fetched his shovel. The digging took the better part of the afternoon. The ground out past the fence line was hard-packed and full of caliche. And by the time he'd gone deep enough to satisfy his conscience, his shirt was soaked through and his hands were raw. He wrapped the warrior's body in a horse blanket, the only decent cloth he owned to spare, and laid him in the earth facing east, though he couldn't have said why that felt like the right direction. He said no words over the grave. He didn't know any that would fit, and it seemed worse to borrow the wrong ones than to offer silence. If this story's already pulling you in, go ahead and hit subscribe. It costs nothing, and it means a lot to a small channel like this one. He rode home in the last violet light of dusk, the kind that made the desert look almost gentle, and told himself the matter was finished. A man was buried. The ground was settled. Tomorrow there would be fences to mend and cattle to count, and this would become one more thing Thomas Bellinger had buried and did not speak of. But that night, for the first time in longer than he could remember, the coyotes went quiet all at once, every last one of them, across every draw and ridge for as far as sound carried, and did not start again until well past midnight. Thomas lay awake in the dark, listening to that unnatural silence, and felt, without any reason he could name, that something had noticed what he'd done. He didn't yet know that somewhere out past the fence line, standing over freshly turned earth, something with amber eyes had also noticed, and that it did not consider the debt repaid. The silence didn't end with the coyotes. It stretched into the days that followed like something holding its breath, waiting for Thomas to notice it had never truly gone quiet at all. Merely changed its register, dropped below what a man's ears could easily catch. He told himself it was nerves. A dead man on his land would put anyone on edge, Apache or otherwise. He mended fence, fed stock, rode the perimeter twice a day instead of once, and did not speak of the grave to anyone in Serrano's Crossing when he rode in for flour and cartridges. Some things, once said aloud, took on a weight they hadn't carried before. It was on the fourth night that the dreams began. He was standing in a canyon he didn't recognize, moonlight pooling silver in a wash of pale rock, and a man stood across from him, young, maybe not yet 25, with a face Thomas somehow already knew, though he'd never seen it living. The warrior's expression was not anger, it was urgency, the particular urgency of a man running out of time to say something that mattered. Behind the warrior, the canyon walls seemed to breathe. Thomas woke with his heart slamming against his ribs and the taste of dust in his mouth, though his own bedroom held nothing but the ordinary dark. The second dream came 2 nights later, and this one showed him more. The warrior running, not from soldiers, not from rival bands, but from something in the brush that moved wrong, too low and too fast, its shape shifting in and out of the moonlight like the eye refused to hold it steady. An arrow loosed, not at the warrior, but past him from another hand entirely. A warning shot, Thomas understood with the strange clarity dreams sometimes offer, meant to drive him toward the only safety left, which was distance, which was speed, which had not been enough. He woke that time already speaking, though he couldn't recall what words had been in his mouth. By the third dream, 4 nights later still, the fragments had become a story, assembled the way a man assembles a stranger's life from scattered belongings left behind. The warrior had a name once. Thomas caught only pieces of the sound, foreign to his tongue, gone before he could hold it. He had a brother. He had crossed into a stretch of canyon country his people avoided for reasons older than any living memory, chasing a strayed horse he couldn't afford to lose, and what found him there wore the shape of a man until it didn't. Why? Thomas asked in the dream, the only word that seemed to fit. The warrior didn't answer with words. He turned instead and looked west, toward the ridge past Thomas's own fence line, the direction from which the wind had come the day of the burial. And his meaning arrived the way understanding sometimes does, whole and certain, without needing translation. It followed the trail. It follows what feeds it. Thomas woke a final time before dawn and did not go back to sleep. He sat at his kitchen table until first light with his rifle across his knees, resting there, not raised, not aimed, just present, the way a man keeps a tool near when the work ahead is uncertain, turning the dreams over in his mind and trying to fit them into any shape that made sense. Grief could do strange things to sleep, guilt too, and he supposed he carried some of that, however little cause he had. But 3 dreams, each building on the last like chapters in a book he hadn't asked to read, felt like more than a mind working through its own unease. He rode out to the grave that morning. The earth sat undisturbed and settled and quiet under the climbing sun exactly as he'd left it. But the brush along the ridge to the west showed something he hadn't noticed before. A wide, flattened trail through the mesquite, too broad for a coyote, too strange in its print for anything Thomas had tracked in 15 years on this land. Something heavy had passed through, and recently moving with a gait that left marks his eye couldn't quite reconcile into any animal he knew. He crouched over one print a long while, hat brim shading his eyes, and felt the same cold certainty settle into his chest that he'd felt standing over the warrior's body 2 weeks before. Whatever had taken that young man's life in the canyon country hadn't stayed in the canyon country. It had followed the trail east, and it had followed it here. The attack came just after midnight, and Thomas knew it before he was fully awake. Some animal part of his own mind recognizing the wrongness of the sound before his conscious mind caught up. Not the bawling of a spooked steer, something lower, more panicked, cut short too fast and too clean. He was out of bed and reaching for his boots before he'd finished blinking away sleep. The rifle came off its pegs by the door, and he held it low and ready in both hands, not raised, not yet, just carried the way a man carries a tool he hopes he won't need, as he crossed the yard toward the corral. The moon hung 3/4 full, throwing enough light to see by, which was almost worse than darkness would have been. 6 head of cattle stood bunched against the far rail, trembling, wild-eyed, breath fogging hard in the cool night air. A 7th lay still in the dirt near the gate, and even from 30 feet, Thomas could see this was no wolf's work, no mountain lion dragging down a calf for a meal. The stillness of the animal had a wrongness to it, a violence implied in the way it lay rather than shown outright. A scene his mind understood was terrible without needing to catalog why. He stopped at the corral fence, pulse loud in his own ears, and scanned the tree line beyond the pasture. Nothing moved, and then everything did. It came out of the mesquite 30 yards off, and Thomas's mind tried for one useless half-second to make it into something ordinary. A bear, a horse spooked loose, anything that belonged to the world he understood. But it stood the way no bear stood, upright on legs that bent wrong at the knee, shoulders broad as a doorway. And when it turned its head toward him, 2 points of amber caught the moonlight and held there, steady, considering him the way a man might consider an old debt finally come due. Thomas didn't run. Some instinct older than fear told him running was the one thing that would end this badly and immediately. He held still instead, rifle resting across his forearm, and made himself breathe. The creature huffed, a low, rolling sound, more air than voice, and took one slow step sideways. Not toward him, not away. Matted fur catching torn threads of moonlight as it moved along the tree line's edge. It was testing something Thomas understood, the way a man tests ice before he trusts his full weight to it. Testing whether he'd bolt, testing whether he'd raise the rifle. He did neither. For a long, suspended moment, they simply looked at each other across 30 yards of trembling cattle and torn night air, and Thomas felt the strange, vertiginous certainty that the thing recognized him, knew this land, knew this fence line, knew, perhaps, exactly whose hands had dug a grave 2 weeks past on the far side of that ridge. Then it turned, unhurried, contemptuous, almost in its lack of urgency, and melted back into the mesquite, the way deep water closes over a dropped stone. Thomas stood at the fence until his hands stopped shaking, which took longer than he wanted to admit. When he finally trusted his legs, he checked the herd, one dead, the rest gathered close and shivering but unhurt, and walked the fence line twice more before dawn with the rifle never leaving his hands, though he never raised it again that night. By first light, he'd made 2 decisions. The first was that he would ride to Serrano's crossing that same morning, whatever it cost him in pride, and find out if any man there had heard of such a thing before, because whatever this was, it was old knowledge somewhere carried in stories Thomas had never had cause to learn. The second decision was harder to sit with, though he knew it was true the moment it formed. This wasn't finished. Whatever debt or grievance or recognition had passed between him and that creature in the dark, it hadn't ended with a retreat into the brush. It had only been postponed. He buried the dead steer before noon, the second grave he dug on this land in as many weeks, and rode for town with the sun still climbing and the weight of the warrior's warning finally, fully understood. Thomas rode home from Serrano's crossing with more questions than answers. The men at the trading post had gone quiet and strange when he'd tried, carefully, to ask about creatures in the canyon country. One old-timer had simply set down his coffee and walked out without a word, and nobody else had met his eyes after that. Whatever this thing was, it lived in a silence deeper than superstition. It lived in a silence people protected. He reached the ranch as the light was failing, unsaddled his horse with hands still stiff from the ride, and did not sleep so much as wait for the dream to come. It came differently this time. The warrior stood closer than before, close enough that Thomas could see the details his mind had softened in earlier visits. A scar along one forearm, a woven cord at his wrist, dark eyes that held less urgency now and more of something that might have been resolve. Behind him, the canyon had changed too, no longer a place of pursuit, a place of stillness, moonlit and waiting. "I buried you the only way I knew how," Thomas said. And in the dream, his voice sounded strange to his own ears, thick with everything the week had cost him. "I didn't ask for this." The warrior's expression didn't shift, but something in the air between them did. A loosening, the particular quiet that comes after a test finally passed. He raised one hand and Thomas saw, resting in the open palm, a single curved claw, black as river stone, worn smooth along one edge as though it had been carried a long while before it was ever offered. It remembers what it was before, the warrior seemed to say, though no words moved between them in any language Thomas could name. That is the door, not silver, not fire. What it was before it stopped being a man. Thomas didn't understand, not fully, but he understood enough that the creature had once worn a human shape and a human name, and that whatever act had unmade that name might, if faced directly, be turned back against the thing that had inherited it. The warrior closed his fingers around the claw and pressed it somehow into Thomas's own hand, and the weight of it in the dream felt entirely, impossibly real. "Why me?" Thomas asked. "Why not your own people?" "Because you dug with your own hands for a stranger who owed you nothing," came the answer, quiet as settling dust. "That is not nothing, in a world like this one." Thomas woke at first light with his right hand closed into a fist, and when he opened it, his breath caught hard in his chest. A single black claw lay in his palm, worn smooth along one edge, exactly as it had appeared in the dream, solid, cold, undeniably real in a way that no dream had any right to be. He sat with it a long while, turning it over in the growing light, and felt the last of his doubt burn away like morning mist off the flats. Whatever walked his land in the shape of a monster had once been a man, and somewhere beneath the fur and the amber eyes, some sliver of that man might still remember what he'd lost. If you're still with me this deep into the story, take a second and drop a comment, just your city and country, so I know how far this tale has traveled tonight. Thomas spent that day preparing in ways he hadn't allowed himself to before. He checked his rifle and set it near the door, not as a weapon he intended to raise in threat, but as a last resort he hoped he wouldn't need. He gathered rope, a lantern, a knife he rarely carried. And as dusk came down over the ridge, he rode out toward the flattened trail through the mesquite, the claw wrapped tight in a strip of cloth and tucked against his chest, toward whatever waited for him in the dark beyond the fence line. He did not know yet whether he rode toward a confrontation or a reckoning. Only that the warrior's debt and his own had become somewhere in these last weeks the same debt entirely, and that some things, once begun, could not be left buried. The trail through the mesquite led Thomas deeper than he'd ever ridden on his own land, past the boundary fence and into country that belonged by any paper claim to no one at all. The lantern he carried threw a small, trembling circle of light that made the darkness beyond it feel larger, hungrier, though he forced himself to breathe evenly and keep his horse moving forward. He found the creature waiting for him at the mouth of a shallow canyon already transformed, already still, standing motionless in a wash of pale moonlight, the way a man might stand at a gate he'd been guarding a long time. It did not charge. It did not retreat. It simply watched him approach with those amber eyes, patient in a way Thomas hadn't expected. And some instinct told him this was not the same encounter as the corral fence. He dismounted a cautious distance away, rifle left, resting across the saddle, and drew the cloth-wrapped claw from inside his coat instead. "I know what you were," Thomas said, and his voice carried further than he meant it to in the canyon stillness. "A man told me, showed me." The creature went very still, stiller than before, if such a thing were possible, and its huffing breath slowed to something almost like listening. Thomas held the claw out on his open palm, and in the moonlight, the beast's massive head lowered slightly, amber eyes fixed not on Thomas but on the small black object resting there, worn smooth along one edge by hands that had carried it far longer than Thomas had. For a long moment, nothing in the canyon moved at all. Then, low and rolling, almost gentle. The creature made a sound Thomas hadn't heard from it before. Not a growl, not a warning, but something closer to grief, the kind of sound a man might make finding an old photograph of someone he'd buried long ago. It took one step back, then another, and in the space between one breath and the next, understanding arrived in Thomas's chest the same way the warrior's warnings always had. Whole, certain, needing no translation. The creature hadn't hunted the warrior out of malice. It hadn't stalked Thomas's herd out of hunger alone. It had been guarding this canyon, this whole stretch of country, from something worse that moved through these hills every few years when the moon and the season aligned just so. Something the warrior's own people had learned generations back to avoid entirely rather than face. The warrior had wandered into ground the creature had claimed as a boundary line, a warning shot loosed not by malice but by desperation, an old promise the creature had made to itself long before it stopped being a man, to keep whatever waited beyond that canyon from ever crossing east toward the ranches and towns of ordinary people. It had been paying a debt of its own, in the only language it had left. Thomas lowered his hand slowly, the claw still resting in his palm, and felt something between the two of them settle into an uneasy, wordless truce. The creature held his gaze one final moment, amber eyes steady, almost sorrowful, before turning and moving back into the deeper dark of the canyon, unhurried, its duty apparently unbroken by the night's strange visitor. Thomas rode home before dawn with the claw still in his coat, and buried it that same morning beside the warrior's grave, wrapped in the same horse blanket he'd used weeks before. A debt repaid to a debt he hadn't known he owed, laid to rest beside the man who'd first shown him the shape of it. If this story kept you until the very end, hit subscribe before you go. There's another tale waiting, and I'd love to tell it to you. Thomas Bellinger never spoke of that autumn to another living soul, not in 15 more years on that land, not even in the quiet hours when grief made a man want to confess things to no one in particular. He kept the ranch. He mended the same fences, buried more things the desert took from him, and grew old the way men on that land generally did, slowly and without much ceremony. But some nights, when the moon hung full and heavy over the western ridge, he'd walk out past the fence line and stand a while at the two graves resting side by side in the settled earth, and he'd think about debts, how some were paid in coin and some in labor, and some in nothing more than a stranger's willingness to dig when digging cost him something. He never saw the creature again. He never needed to. Some guardians, he came to understand, did their work best unseen in silence, at the edges of the world, where ordinary men rarely thought to look. And some debts, once honored, simply held, the way a grave holds, the way a promise holds, long after the hands that made it have gone still. If you want to hear where this canyon story leads next, subscribe and stay a while longer. There are more tales like this one waiting in the dark.